All right, Bible reader, it is time for 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and I'm going to try and summarize this chapter. It's a little bit different. It just feels, every chapter has a little bit different feel, and this one kind of stands out to me from the previous few chapters that I've done. So let's get into it. So I'm asking a question, sort of, which is another Jesus, another Spirit, another gospel. Why is Paul saying these things? Well, that's what I'm going to explain, or at least attempt to explain, as well as many other things. So let's jump right into it. Verse 1. Would to God ye could bear with me a little in my folly, and indeed bear with me. Paul talks in a very different way in this chapter. There's almost a touch of sarcasm to it. I don't know. You let me know what you think. Verse 2. For I am jealous over you with a godly jealousy, for I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. This is Paul's way of speaking of the body of Christ. And he takes it as that he's almost like a father presenting us as a chaste virgin to Christ. Verse 3, but I fear lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your minds should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. Hey, verse 3 is a direct reference to what happened in Genesis 3, where the serpent came and it was the first time he spoke to mankind. And essentially the first words out of his mouth were, yea, hath God said. He asked them a question. And what a powerful question it was. It has stood the test of time. And what happened there was Adam basically stood by and watched. Eve added to God's words. And the rest is history. This is the method of operation. Satan and his angels question what God says and cause mankind to question, where's God's words? Is it in the original manuscript? Is it in the scholars? Do I have to go to a priest and have him mediate for me so I know what God said? And look, it's like Baskin Robbins. Pick your flavor of deception. It all stems from, what did God say? Where are God's words? Can you hold them in your hands? I believe I can. I believe I am right now. So what does this corrupted state lead to? Okay, Paul very clearly talks about through his subtlety, through the subtlety of the serpent, which is Satan, your mind should be corrupted. So what is this corruption that he speaks of? Well, he's going to explain. In verse 4, for if he that cometh preacheth another Jesus. Okay, a lot of people that aren't Bible readers, they come to or they hear things like this and they're like, what do you mean another Jesus? How can there be another Jesus? Well, Paul warned us about this on multiple occasions, this being one of them. He goes on, whom we have not preached, or if ye receive another spirit, which ye have not received. See, as a child of God, I've received the Holy Spirit. Paul is kicking open the door of the possibility that you can receive another spirit. This sounds a lot like, possession by the devil's angels. So what do you think's going on in these charismatic churches when these people babble on and fall on the ground shaking? What do you think's going on there? Yeah, I know what's going on there. I've been in the presence of all that. And there's a darkness that comes with all that. Paul continues, or another gospel. Okay, this is an interesting one because I believe that when you read the Bible rightly divided along dispensational lines, you very clearly, very easily understand that there's not just one gospel from Genesis to Revelation. That's not the purpose of this video. I've got content on that, but it's not the purpose of this video. But the point is, don't believe what I say. But Paul kicks the door open and says, hey, there's another gospel. And it can be accepted. He says, which ye have not accepted. You might you might well bear with him. The point is that Paul says there's another gospel, there's another spirit, and there's the possibility of another Jesus. All these things are possible. So you better know which Jesus, which spirit, and which gospel. And the only way you can know that with any kind of certainty is to rightly divide the word of truth along dispensational lines. Paul just happens to be the minister of a particular dispensation called the dispensation of the grace of God. Okay? So be wary. Be wary of another Jesus, another spirit, and another gospel. And think about the implications of that. What's that saying? It's easier to fool somebody than it is to convince them that they've been fooled. Let me say that again. It's easier to fool somebody than it is to convince somebody that they've been fooled. This is a truism that stands the test of time, and the devil knows this. The devil knows if he can just get your mind fooled once, kind of looking off over here, well, you may never look the right way again. You'll just keep chasing bunny trail after bunny trail after bunny trail, and this conspiracy and this idea, and you'll have 10,000 teachers, and you'll just be in la la land. And the whole time, the devil's just like, yep, gotcha. Gotcha, sucker. People are trying to follow the Jesus that was presenting himself as Messiah to the Jews to this very day. I could throw a rock, well, almost on a good day, I could throw a rock and hit a messianic church that is doing just this. It's a prominent messianic church in my area. And they're trying to follow Jesus as he was the Messiah presenting himself to the nation of Israel that ultimately got rejected. But then, to make matters even worse, they're blending all that with certain aspects of Christianity, or what they call Christianity. What a train wreck. Okay, so this, when you try to do that, that is absolutely going to lead to the wrong spirit, and it's ultimately to another gospel. And this other gospel requires people to trust in their works, such as water baptism, or the idea of trying to be sinless. Hey, this is not me making stuff up. I have conversations with people. It's been a little while on the sinless thing, but it was just a few months ago. And this person told me they don't sin. Hey, truth is stranger than fiction sometimes. All right. So this has become the root of hundreds of religions, possibly thousands of religions. You start getting into areas like India and Pakistan, and those people have a religion based around everything. Thousands of denominations within the United States, hundreds of Bible versions. I don't know what the exact count is. Some people say over 500 different Bible versions. I don't know. I don't really see that in the marketplace. But I can easily say there's a couple hundred versions of the Bible. And it all leads to one thing. And it's this: no one is confident of what God said. And that just leads to more and more religion. And so I'm going to ask you, I'm going to hit you with a question that I'm not going to answer. Do you know where God's words are today? Do you know confidently where God's words are? I talk about this subject quite a bit, and I've covered it in more detail in other videos. I'm not going to go any further than that here. But I hope if you're listening to this and you don't know where God's words are, you can't confidently say, I believe these are God's words. I hope this question sticks in your brain and just itches you and itches you and itches you until you figure it out. So let's move on. Verse 5, for I suppose I was not a whit behind the very chiefest apostles, but though I be rude in speech, yet not in knowledge. But we have been throughly made manifest among you in all things. Throughly is not the same thing as thoroughly. Do a word study on it. It's a good one, and it'll expand your mind and your vocabulary, your biblical vocabulary. So Paul understood he was not the best orator, or that that was even his role to play as the minister of the dispensation of the grace of God. And this is, by the way, the only time rude is used in the Bible. And generally, it means rough, crude, or unlearned. So by contrast, some said that his letters, speaking of Paul's letters, are weighty and powerful. That's in 2 Corinthians 10:10. So letters that are weighty and powerful, as opposed to, though I be rude in speech, right? Crude, unlearned, rough, but yet his letters were weighty and powerful. Interesting contrast. So bottom line is, Paul was a better writer than a speaker. Consequently, he wrote 13 books of the New Testament. Verse 7, have I committed an offense in abasing myself that ye might be exalted, because I have preached to you the gospel of God freely? I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. Okay, let's break this down a little bit. Verse 8 is interesting. So there's two things here. Paul clearly took what he considered wages from other churches. Okay, that's a standalone idea. And it's interesting because in many places, Paul talks about supporting himself with his tent making. And I believe for the most part, that's what he did. But clearly, at some point, he took what he considered wages from other churches, not from the Corinthians. And then the second point in verse 8 is that Paul clearly thought of taking these wages as having robbed them. That was his attitude toward taking money from the churches. He felt like he was robbing them. And I think this says much about Paul's attitude concerning taking money from local churches. You know, there was probably just, you know, at whatever point he did take what he thought of as the wages, he must have been just in dire straits. Like he probably just had to do it. And I'm sure the people that gave that money did not consider themselves as being robbed. But nonetheless, this was Paul's attitude toward it. Verse 9. And when I was present with you and wanted, see that? He didn't say and needed. Needs are like food, clothing, shelter. But he says he wanted. I was chargeable to no man. For that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. And in all things I have kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so will I keep myself. So Paul purposed to not take money from these Corinthians for whatever reason. You know, Corinth was known to be a wealthy city. And so maybe these believers were wealthy, and Paul just didn't, maybe he was just trying to make a point of not taking their money, because probably it would just be them giving out of their abundance. I'm not really sure. Total speculation right there. So I'm going to get back to the scriptures. Verse 10, as the truth of Christ is in me, no man shall stop me of this boasting in the regions of Achaia. Wherefore? Because I love you not, God knoweth. But what I do, that I will do, that I may cut off occasion from them which desire occasion, that wherein they glory, they may be found even as we. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. So who are these people? So it's worth considering that Paul refers to false apostles, deceitful workers, and those that transform themselves into the apostles of Christ, all in the same sentence. How many religious people call themselves apostle today? Does your church have apostles? Have you ever thought about it? You listen to apostles on YouTube? I want you to think about it. I personally believe that from the scriptures, Paul was the last qualified apostle. There's no other apostles of God after the apostle Paul. So if you're following somebody, or you are listening to somebody, or you're in the presence of somebody that calls themselves an apostle today, my belief is they're a false apostle. All right, it gets worse. Verse 14, and no marvel, Now think about this for a second. Paul just gets done saying, for such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ, period. But then he starts off the next verse with, and no marvel. This is a continued thought. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. I talk about this from time to time. Haven't talked about it in a while, but many people that have some kind of testimony of their salvation or whatever, they talk about an angel of light. It's generally standing at the foot of their bed or something that happened at night. And they seem to be completely unaware of the fact that Satan can transform himself into an angel of light. If that's what you need in order to be fooled, trust me, he will provide you with an angel of light. And it's not necessarily Satan himself, right? It's just that Paul makes it clear that Satan himself can do this. But look at 15. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers, this is a reference to his angels. I think it's also a reference to anybody that is essentially, what's the word I'm looking for? Like coming into, being like a fellow helper of sorts with Satan, aligning themselves with the powers of darkness. So therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. If you are counting on your works for salvation and teaching others the same, you've joined a very large group of deceitful workers, as well as being a minister of Satan. Don't buy into that works-based salvation nonsense, lordship salvation, sonship salvation, all this kind of, look, I'll give you a little tip. Whenever you hear anybody, and I'm talking about people in kind of my school of thought of rightly dividing and dispensations, anybody in Baptist organizations, Pentecostal and charismatic organizations, Roman Catholic, you hear anybody using words and phrases that are not in the Bible, boom, huge red flag. Like literally, don't go past go. Like stop, look it up, and ask yourself, why is this person using words and phrases that are not in God's words? Because I assure you that for the most part, it's an effort to deceive you. Because the root of it is, yea, hath God said? Oh, I'll just change God's words a little bit. That's what Satan does. That's how Satan first approached man. That's his overriding method of operation to this day, is to convince you that you don't know what God said. So therefore, you can be fooled by anything. So when people use non-biblical words to try to describe biblical things, red flag, huge red flag, and ask yourself why. Especially somebody that's putting themselves out there as a teacher, me. Okay, I'm putting myself out there as a teacher. I'm not ashamed of that. Preachers, pastors, evangelists, anybody of that nature, and they're using non-biblical words to describe biblical things. It's a huge red flag. You need to chase that down and ask yourself why. Verse 16, I say again, let no man think me a fool, if otherwise, yet as a fool receive me, that I may boast myself a little bit. Hear that kind of sarcasm a little bit? That which I speak it not after the Lord, but as it were foolishly in this confidence of boasting. Seeing that many glory after the flesh, I will glory also. Hey, so there's 2 verses in Psalms. I didn't really prepare this thought, but it just kind of reminds me here. And it talks about 2 different ways to deal with a fool. One is depending on if the person that's a fool is actually sincere and wanting to learn. You deal with that kind of fool differently. If it's a fool that's just mocking, well, you deal with them accordingly. So it's answer a fool not according to his folly, and then the next verse is answer a fool according to his, anyway, I'm paraphrasing, but the point is you have to discern what kind of fool you're dealing with and then respond accordingly. And I think what Paul is doing here is he's applying that biblical principle. And people, possibly the people of Corinth, maybe had a problem with boasting or, kind of speaking not after the Lord and things of this nature. And he's kind of turning that around on them just a little bit. Verse 18, seeing that many glory after the flesh, I will glory also, for ye suffer fools gladly, seeing ye yourselves are wise. See, we shouldn't, it's good to be wise, right? We should seek wisdom, but we shouldn't, there's two things here. We shouldn't go out and, put ourselves out into the world and go, I'm wise, right? But more importantly, when it's just you by yourself and nobody else is around, we shouldn't be telling ourselves, oh, I'm wise. I know I'm wise and everybody else is stupid, right? We shouldn't be doing that. We should strive to be wise, but humility kind of dictates that you keep your head down and just keep moving forward. Verse 20, for ye suffer if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take you, if a man exalt himself, if a man smite you on the face, I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit, whensoever any is bold, I speak foolishly, he says. Why would Paul say such a thing? I think he's trying to make a point. I am bold also, he says. Yeah, Paul was nothing if he wasn't bold. They at one point they stoned him, and the disciples thought he was dead, or the other apostles thought he was dead, and he stands up and he walks right back into the city that stoned him. Paul was the epitome of bold. And here Paul gives what can be considered in modern terms as his credentials. It's a long list, and it's a very specific kind of credentialed list. He does this on multiple occasions when he has to kind of defend who he is. He tells his story and talks about, but this is kind of a different list. I think it's a purpose-built list for people that are like the Corinthians. So he says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. He says parenthetically, I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes, save one. The reason why it's 40 stripes, save one, is because the Jews had a tradition or a belief that they thought 40, 40 whippings, and these aren't, these weren't just whips. Like I grew up around whips. I grew up on a horse ranch, and so we had all kinds of whips, big, long, crack type whips, and little kind of short things that would just kind of do a little snapping sound to get the horse's attention. We had all kinds of whips. But the kind of whip that the Jews used, it was like this leather strap, and it was embedded with like shards of glass and other kinds of sharp bits and things. And then when they whipped you with it, at the point of contact, generally on the back, then the person with the whip would drag it, and so that coarse, sharp, whip end would just rip the flesh off of you. Okay, and so, but they had this custom, if you will, that 40 stripes would kill a man, and so they would never go more than 39 because their intent wasn't to kill the man. Anyway, just thought you might find that interesting if you've never heard that before. Paul continues with his credentials. Thrice, meaning 3. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. That was the reference I was talking about where they thought he was dead. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often. Yeah, Paul got around. In perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by my own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often. Hey, this is easy to read. In watchings often. What was he watching for? I think many times he was watching for those that wanted to kill him. And so he had to set up watches, whether it was him or men with him, but they probably, as they're in the wilderness or traveling on the roads or whatever, somebody had to stay awake and keep watch. That's stressful. That's very stressful. In hunger and thirst, in fastings often. I don't think Paul was just simply fasting for spiritual purposes here. I think it was simply a lack of food based upon the circumstances that he found himself in, running for his life, hiding in the wilderness. It was just a matter of fact that he was going to go days without food, in cold and nakedness. Sounds like one of those survival shows. There's so many of them out there now. But this was as real as it gets. Verse 28, beside those things that are without. Okay, so this whole list of things I just read, Paul just kind of almost brushes them off by saying, besides those things that are without, meaning like without, they're like, outside of him, or it only affects his body. That which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. So not only did he have to deal with all the things that I just read, but he also had to concern himself with the care of all the churches. It's a big burden. How do you think Paul handled it? Well, I think he ran his race and he finished it exactly the way that he wanted to. Did he have some regrets? I don't know, maybe. But he finished his race. Beside those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. And then he goes on with questions. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is offended and I burn not? If I must needs glory, I will glory of the things which concern mine infirmities. Man, Paul's attitude was so interesting. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is blessed forevermore, knoweth that I lie not. In Damascus, the governor under Aretas, the king, kept the city of the Damascenes with a garrison, desirous to apprehend me. And through a window in a basket was I let down by the wall and escaped his hands. So if you're not familiar with many of the ways that cities were built, oftentimes they had these, sometimes they had like geographical boundaries, that were hard to penetrate, so to speak. And then the city was, had a wall around it. And some of the people lived on the wall, so to speak, like their room was adjacent to the wall and there was a window. And so he was literally like, somehow they got a basket and rope or whatever, and they let him down out of this window to escape. So apparently, this Aretas, the king, didn't foresee that. All right, so just a couple of my thoughts on Paul in relation to everything we just read. I think Paul had a life that can be viewed from many perspectives. I spend a lot of time thinking about Paul. I've focused on Paul quite a bit in the last, especially since probably 2008. And I think the way that you perceive Paul has much to do with who you are as a person. So I personally think Paul enjoyed all of it in one way or another. I think he likely saw himself as perfectly cut out for the job as the minister of the dispensation of the grace of God. And the reason I say that is because think about who he was as Saul of Tarsus. Okay, we have a pretty good picture of who he was as Saul. Number one, he was zealous of what he thought was righteousness, even to the point of killing and imprisoning people that he thought were blaspheming his God. And so he, as Saul of Tarsus, he literally went out and about looking for those that were blaspheming his God, and he either killed them or he brought them back to Rome, to be judged or be imprisoned or what have you, and most likely put to death. And so this was who this man was. He was really a warrior's warrior, but he was also extremely intelligent and well-educated, and he was a good writer and not necessarily a good speaker. So that's what I got for you today. I'm glad you're here. Hope you got something out of it. Please subscribe to the channel. If you think you know somebody that might get some encouragement or insight out of this, please share the video. It helps me to reach more people. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks.